Kia ora, Chris here for NZDP101, and we are on week 2, and this is the instructional video tutorial for the Willa image. Let's see what we've got to work with. First thing you'll notice is the image is quite underexposed. Now, the good news is that we haven't lost any detail in terms of the highlights being lost, but the original image could have been exposed more to start with. But one of the reasons we look at these images is to show you what you can do to restore things. Say you take a shot and it's the only shot that you've got, and you have to hand it over to a client. Ideally, it would be good if you get it right in camera, but sometimes things just don't work, and you do need to go and fix that. So let's have a look. First of all, we need to adjust the overall exposure, and we want to bring that up so that the sand is fairly close to correct. Now, even when we've done that, you can see that Willa herself is underexposed. And I should say that this image is one of Phil Davidson's, so yeah, it's worth acknowledging the copyright on that, or the original author. So next thing we can do is we can actually lift the shadows up. Now, I'm using Lightroom, but the same functionality exists in Adobe Camera Raw, and in fact, if we go and open it as a smart object in Adobe Camera Raw. I will pause the video for a second while my Photoshop boots up. And you can see, because I opened it as a smart object, it's got this little picture on the layers image. So if we click on that smart object thumbnail, double click, it'll open it back into Raw, and you can actually see the same edits are done in both Lightroom and Raw. So it's quite a nice functionality, being able to swap between the two. Because the Creative Cloud Suite comes with Lightroom now, I've moved more to actually teaching you how to use Lightroom, because that's what most professional photographers will use for their basic day-to-day editing, or another similar file management system. Unfortunately, there aren't many valid options yet that are quite as good as Photoshop. It's still got that head start. Anyway, so the next thing is the image itself is quite blue. There's quite a strong color class to it, and it's got a beach feeling, so let's make things a little bit more as if we're at a beach, and just warm that image up a little bit. So that's starting to come together a little bit more. The next thing we want to do is to crop in and actually put Willa on the thirds a little bit, so that she's on the thirds, and we can use this shadow line as a leading line, brings us in. Now, you might be able to see that little red patch come up there. That's a warning light on the histogram, and it's just to say that the highlights are just a little bit overexposed and we're starting to lose detail. You can get the same thing with the blacks if you pull the blacks too far down, particularly with the whites, because we're drawn to white areas, bright high contrast areas. You do want to make sure that they retain detail. So that's one thing. What else can we do? Well, it's still a portrait, so we want the viewer's attention more on the person rather than the background. So one of the ways of doing that is, if we pull the exposure back a little bit, we can actually put an adjustment layer over everything except the person, and just make that pop a little bit more. Now, what you want to be careful with is you don't want to end up with halos around this, and by halo I mean this type of effect. In fact, I'm going to make it worse. There you go. That's a really bad halo. And you do want to make sure that you don't leave lines in the rest of the image. Now, if I go change that back, I can actually go and put the patches in that I've missed. And then, yeah, I mean, in some ways it's actually a good idea to draw in with a heavier adjustment brush, and then back the adjustment off on the slider, which can be quite a good way of making sure that you don't have halos with the layer masks. But really the only way of making sure that you don't have halos is going in and working with a smaller brush and getting closer and closer as you can. And the other option is to have that overlap happen more on the person, particularly with if you're doing the same thing with a horizon of a landscape or something, then the blend happening in the darker area seems to be less visible to our eyes, which is an interesting challenge. So yeah, it's going to take a bit of work to get a really close version of this, if that's what you're trying to do. But of course, as soon as we back off the amount of change in exposure, then a lot of those things will just not vanish. Will vanish, and we don't really notice that. Which is cool. That's the main aim of Photoshop, is that you're aiming to do the changes and not let somebody actually notice that you've done them. So next one is just a little bit of clarity and exposure to the face. As again with portraits, we're drawn to faces, so having them just a little bit brighter, or having eyes just a little bit brighter, can help hold our attention on that object. And pretty much that's it. So yeah, it gives you an introduction to a practical application on one particular image. Go ahead and have a practice on the others. You do have 2 other videos on the introduction to how to use Adobe Camera Raw, and pretty much the 2 are interchangeable between Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, if my microphone doesn't die again. So yeah, post your comments to your discussion board. You're not uploading them to your tutor this week. And once you've got some feedback on those from your fellow students, look out for things like halos. Have a look at your images and see, is there anything in it that's distracting, that's not what's the main focus, what's drawing our attention away, and give your fellow students some feedback, and practice that part of things. Then you're of course working on the next images, Rock On, Big Ben, Grace Dew Priory, and the Hooded Vulture, and those are due in week 3.